You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and I'm really happy that we have finally convinced Tom to walk into the line stand and experience about 1 hour of non-stop criticism and well-deserved hate. As, yes, this is the long advertised episode where we all gang up on Tom for hating documentaries. What's wrong with him? We'll find out. I guess we could have done a more respectful episode where we talked about whether or not documentaries can truly be said to be art, do fiction versus reality, and just talk it all out. But no, he doesn't deserve that. Adam is here, he's upset. Saul is here, he's upset, and of course I'm here and I'm pretty upset about this too. But we'll hear more about that later. So first, Tom, thank you for allowing us to do this to you. So to just get the ball rolling here, what's wrong with you?
Well, that's a good question, Chris, but I don't think we want to delve into the psychology of what's wrong with me on Talking Images. But in terms of documentaries, I suppose I don't really hate them. Hate's quite a strong word. I just have a strong disinterest to the point where I'm not bothered about watching them. They don't really do much for me. I suppose it could be no different to people avoiding a particular genre because it isn't to the taste. That's essentially where I sit when it comes to documentaries. If we want to look into why that is, I suppose it could potentially stem from when I first started getting into film. And this conversation has come up a lot where we always go into the IMDb Top 250 seems to be a gateway into cinema. Now, the IMDb Top 250 excludes documentaries. So when I was starting on my journey into cinema, I didn't really watch many documentaries because I was working through the best films. When my interest in cinema expanded to the point that I discovered iCheck Movies and the iCheck Movies forum, I started working on the most favourite list. Now, to my mind, the documentaries on that list could potentially be what put me off documentaries. There's a lot of obscure stuff on there, and all the obscure films that I checked out because of this list were incredible. I had a great time. But the documentaries on that list I found incredibly boring, dull, and just confused as to why they would even be on a list that people would consider amongst their favourite films. So that's probably what turned me off documentaries. And as such, I've not really had an inclination to explore them any further because I get enough kicks out of the films that I experience without having to explore documentaries any further. So that's the brief history. So if the hate wants to begin, go for it, guys. I'm ready.
Yeah, I think people are boiling over here, regardless of how reasonable and sympathetic you try to present your bigotry was there, Tom. We can just go in alphabetical order with you, Adam. Like, what upset you the most with what Tom just said?
Well, it's quite difficult to respond to Tom's very mild-mannered and articulate words.
Yeah, you're screwing it all up for us, Tom.
Yeah, it would be a bit easier if Tom actually was a bit more controversial about this. But sorry, Chris, I know you're looking for hatred and
vitriol and pain, yes.
But I think what Tom said, it didn't make me react very negatively, but it did suggest that he's kind of closed his mind off to like an entire genre on the basis of a couple of experiences. So I think there's potential in this episode to maybe change his views and open his mind a little bit more. It sounds like the reason for him being against documentaries is kind of flimsy. In general, just like with shorts, some people hate shorts and some people hate documentaries. If you close your mind to like an entire genre, you're going to miss out on a lot of great things. And people even do that with feature films, don't they? Like with feature films, some people avoid horror, some people avoid other genres. So I think in general, Tom should try and explore documentaries deeper, and he'll find ones that he likes rather than just working on a couple of lists which have given him a bad experience. Just my hatred and anger at 9 a.m.
That's the issue with having this episode too early, but at least we can get Adam coming in here trying to play good cop and the counselor almost, which he is in real life, just talking, talking Tom through his issues and seeing if he can rehabilitate him. Well, that's that's good for you, Adam. And I see him sending out a big hugging emoji in the chat here for Tom. So just showering some love in this otherwise hate-filled episode. What about you, Saul? How do you react to Tom's disinterest and just general disappointment with documentaries as a whole?
Like Adam has said, it seems that Tom's made this decision about documentaries based on a small handful of documentaries. I don't know the titles in particular, but I think whatever titles they are, they wouldn't be representative as documentaries as a whole genre. So I don't know if we're going to get into recommendations now, so I won't mention any specific titles, but I know that Tom's really into stressful films, and I can think of at least 2 documentaries that are considered to be more stressful than Uncut Gems. So there's a couple of documentaries out there, or there's more than a couple, but 2 in particular I can think of, which are super stress-inducing. And it's just the way that it's put together. There's other documentaries out there which are considered to be like thriller or borderline horror thriller, and I know that Tom's really interested in horror and thrillers. There's also some documentaries out there that do really great things in terms of tracking weird and unusual stories. Other documentaries that do a great job at blending animation together with live action footage. And in addition to that, there's tons of great documentaries that are actually about cinema itself, about films, and also about interpretations of films. So for me, documentaries as a whole is just very broad. And I know people in real life who say they don't watch documentaries, and that's because they think documentaries, David Attenborough, or they think documentaries, just a bunch of talking heads. And to me, there's much more to documentaries than just that. So to me, I guess it's a bit disappointing when somebody says that they refuse to watch documentaries when there are documentaries who do things that are as great as or even better than what narrative cinema can offer.
Now that's an impassionate plea, and we'll explore like what really put Tom off, or if it's really is just talking heads. I mean, what I can say is that I have a huge aversion to talking heads myself, and if we do get into like a, let's say, our documentaries art kind of argument here at some point, I can fully grant that there are some documentaries that are just flat compilations of archival footage, some talking heads, and there's essentially close to no artistry whatsoever. It runs like a 60 minutes episode, and it's pretty much at the low end of what interesting cinema can be. But documentary can also be the most artistic and the most personal, because obviously essay films fit into that category where you can really just have one artist working on this incredible personal vision, sharing their life. I mean, some of the biggest and most beloved films in documentary genre are like the films of Agnes Varda, where she, like The Beaches of Agnes. You have the very obvious The Cleaners and I. Films like that where the artists care about their own life, their own insecurities, their own aging, get really close to them in a different ways. And then, like Saul said, you have documentaries that really dive into genres and they take on the genre aesthetics. They feel truly narrative, and they just build suspense and tension and introduce us to exciting characters. Some of them are the most heartbreaking and touching films you'll ever see. So we'll explore that a little bit shortly. But before that, I would like to know, Tom, are there any documentaries that you actually love?
There are, Chris, surprisingly, but I just thought I'd like to react to some of what you guys say before I get into that. I can say that Sol is certainly appealing to my sensibilities with his descriptions of some of the documentaries that are on his mind, so I am curious to see what he's going to recommend. And Chris, with you just talking about essay films, honestly, the thought of essay films, that just strikes fear into my heart. It's not something that appeals to me whatsoever. That phrase in itself just is a nightmare to me. But anyway,
right. Fair enough. Yeah. That's actually not that big a surprise. Yeah, knowing like how you think about art house and experimental films in general, like there has to be some genre elements there or something like that to really draw you in. Usually, you're not going to sit down and watch the back catalogue of Godard, for instance.
Yeah, no chance. One of the ones that I watched as part of the completing the iCheck Movies Most Favourite list was, as I was moving ahead, occasionally I saw brief glimpses of beauty. And oh my God, that was just so hard to get through. It was really testing my patience, just so dull. And I can't understand what people get out of that film. I really can't. It's experiences like that which kind of put me off exploring the world of documentaries more. When I was first getting into cinema, I did watch a few documentaries, and there are some that I really, really like. One would be Dear Zachary, which that absolutely broke my heart. I know it's a manipulative piece of work, but honestly, I found it incredible and I loved every minute of it. But having said that, once you know what it's about, I don't know whether I'd go back and watch it again. The other ones I love are documentaries that appeal to my interests. So I've got things like Anvil, because I love heavy metal music. I love Spinal Tap. That was a great watch. King of Kong, because I love video games. That's another great one. And also Grizzly Man, because I enjoyed exploring the work of Herzog. For me to get into a documentary, there usually has to be an element that I am interested in it. I see lots of people on the forum who will just delve into any random documentary about all kinds of topics, like, I don't know, fishermen in Asia, and they'll watch it for 2 hours on a way of life that I have like no interest in, and it probably makes me sound really closed-minded, but I watch films for escapism and great stories, and watching something like that doesn't really do that. It's like the equivalent of putting the news on. You know, when you've had a long day at work, you just want to relax. I want the escapism. I don't want the reality. So yeah, there are documentaries that work for me, but not enough to make me want to delve into it more, because I've had a lot of negative experiences when watching documentaries, and they outweigh the good ones.
I just need to say that I really, really, really don't like Dear Zachary. It's actually a perfect example of the kind of documentary I don't like. It had a really great story to tell. It had such a kind of meaningful, emotional kind of story to tell, and it was completely manipulative. And yeah, that's exactly the kind of documentary that I don't want to see again, where it becomes so manipulative that it loses the entire point. So if you like that one, you've got plenty of hope to find other documentaries, because that left a bad taste, that one, for me.
I would probably agree that Dear Zachary isn't super well made from a technical point of view. There's a few like editing montages in there and just the way information's dropped that I didn't quite sort of right with me, but it is definitely a super stressful watch. And that was actually one of the titles that I was thinking of recommending to Tom. So it's great he's already seen and responded it to well, because that's one that I found super stressful. And I think if you're looking for stressful documentaries, there's more that I can recommend when it comes up to that.
I can just really see why Tom would love Dear Zachary, and I actually love Dear Zachary as well. I mean, like everyone says, it's manipulative, and we could possibly argue that it's in slightly bad taste, but this is just a really unnerving, twist-filled, like so much stress-inducing thriller, essentially, about a parental relationship that goes in completely different direction of what you would expect, and it turns everything on its head. And I mean, that's actually a genre of thriller documentary that's kind of been spiking with Netflix as well. I'm not a huge fan of most of those myself, but you have so many variations of true crime or other types of encounter situations that were in some way distressing or horrifying, and they're either they're a movie or they're a miniseries, and they just come in with shocking twist after shocking twist after shocking twist, and just pull you along, like almost like one of those or some of those old school serials, where there's always a huge shock or a huge twist. And I think that in general, documentaries today, that they really want to be thrillers. A lot of documentaries really, really want to have clear narratives, draw you in the same way that thrillers do. And I think that that might be a very huge market for Tom if he becomes a little bit more accepting of exploring those kinds of films and miniseries. Have you been watching like Netflix documentaries, Tom, or like true crime or things like that?
No, I haven't. It's not an area that really appeals to me. It's interesting that I actually watch YouTube channels which have short clips, like 15 to 20 minutes about true crime stories and horrific incidents and things like that, just as kind of like time fillers when I'm on my lunch, or if I've got a bit of time before bed and I'm too tired to watch a film, I'll put them on. But other than that, the long form ones just don't really appeal to me because I'd always rather just be watching a film.
Yeah, fair enough. One of the reasons why this episode started coming up is that Saul and I in particular would be recommending you documentary after documentary, or we would be doing things like our best of the years episodes. You just wouldn't watch the films. Now, I probably have myself to blame a little bit there, because like when we talked about, okay, what kind of documentaries could like break through, and I went straight to essay films. And some of my favorite documentaries are films like Chantal Zuckerman's News from Home, or Powell's films like The Second Night, like a lot of art house semi-experimental films. So I'm probably self-sabotaging myself if I ever recommend something like that to you. But for instance, with Saul here, you guys obviously have very similar tastes, and he's sitting on like a lot of really stressful, like genre-driven documentaries. Like, well, why haven't you been that interested in exploring them?
I suppose you say genre-driven documentaries, but I mean, there's kind of limitations because a film's a documentary. So, I love films for escapism, and I favour unpredictable storylines where literally anything can happen, particularly in like horror and science fiction. So documentaries can't go that far because there's limitations on the format. Whereas other films, the only limitation is the imagination of the creative team behind it. So with horror and science fiction being my favourite films, it's kind of like, well, documentaries are never going to be able to explore those avenues in the way that other films can.
Isn't it also possible that because there is truth to it, that it can seem even more horrifying, the way that, I mean, obviously most horror films aren't based on a true story, but some of them have those based on true story sign coming up at the beginning. But I mean, I know a lot of people who say that, for instance, the non-supernatural horror films, like your Psychos and your slashers, your Michael Myers, they're more scary than your Freddy Kruegers, for instance, just because there's a realism there, like a guy with a knife coming up behind you. It can happen to you in real life. A ghost or an alien is a little bit less likely, let's say. You don't feel like that?
Yeah, I get that. But at the same time, things like aliens and ghosts I just find really fun. I love delving into the world of the supernatural, so it's sure it can't have that realism, but then I'm not necessarily bothered about that because it's a film, so it doesn't necessarily always have to be in the grounds of realism.
It's kind of interesting, Tom, to hear you talk about limitations, because for me, documentaries aren't really about limitations. It's more about a different sort of structure. Because I'm just thinking about it, the way you're sort of talking about it, I'm not really big into biographical films or historical films either. So for that reason would have the same limitations as a film that isn't sci-fi or isn't horror. It's not going to really have the imaginative parts in there, unless you have Quentin Tarantino, who tries to rewrite history with a couple of his films. Generally, if you've got something that's historical or biographical, it's not going to have the same imagination in there. But just the structure of documentary and the way that that can be manipulated by the right filmmaker, that can, to me, be just as effective as a really good thriller. And I guess this might be where I put my first recommendation in. I'll try and keep them minimal because we might have a recommendations section afterwards. But one which I'm thinking of is a film called The Imposter. It's a really enticing, really gripping documentary where it's interviewing this guy who ended up pretending to be the long lost son of this family. And we sort of get information slowly drip fed in interviews, but it's what's happening in between the interviews that actually makes it so interesting. So every so often, as another character is talking, we sort of get these shots of the imposter sort of slowly, slyly smiling at the camera. And every so often, when he finishes talking, it's got like one of those shots in there again. And it's the way those inserts and cutaways are put in there that makes the whole thing really creepy and set it on edge. So for me, it's just a different format to a narrative film. There can still something that's really creepy and really unsettling without having the trappings of a traditional narrative in there.
I mean, I saw a poster because of Sol recommended it to me, and I do actually agree. I think that Tom would really enjoy this one. It's really suspenseful. It's really creepy, and it's one of those films that also turns into something a little bit different than what you might expect in the beginning as that narrative builds. So that's a very good example of a thriller-like documentary, if you will. Do you have any films you think could break through to Tom Adam?
It really depends on what kind of thing Tom's looking for, because I think there's a lot of crime documentaries that Tom would like a lot. For me, I think with the crime ones, it's easy to kind of be turned off on the basis of there being such a high volume of them nowadays. Like, there's some amazing ones, there's lots of really like average ones. Yeah, I'd have to check my ratings for specific recommendations. But I think there's a lot of crime ones that Tom would like, in the sense that although they're documentaries, they have a lot of the same features, a lot of the same qualities as a feature film in terms of the sort of artistic way that the story is told. You know, there's also weird ones, like slightly sort of more eccentric ones, like Hands on a Hard Body, which might not be the greatest film ever, but ones like that I personally love as well. There's a lot of like kind of quirkier ones. I mean, my favorite documentary is Hoop Dreams, and I also love Stevie by the same director. Hoop Dreams and Stevie would be my top two in terms of favorites.
I mean, I'm not sure if Tom will run to see a 3-hour movie about college basketball, which is what Hoop Dreams is. But it is a great film. It's one of the most acclaimed documentaries of all time, and it manages to tell a really great story. And I mean, you mentioned Steve from the director as well, and that's one I think Tom might like even more. And I think that Steve James, the director of these two films, I mean, he's one of those guys who really manages to get really close to his subject and is able to tell really human stories about different kinds of people, eccentric people, wounded people in some ways too. He manages to cut to the core of them in a way that it's quite rare in fiction, to be honest. I mean, obviously you have films like that in fiction too, but because it's real, he manages to really hit those emotional chords well. So definitely something that could be worth it for Tom to explore. And I love the way that Adam just brought up weirder, quirkier, more eccentric style documentaries. I mean, one of my all-time favorite documentaries is Crumb. That's pretty hilarious. You know, it just explores the psyche of Robert Crumb, the animator, his style. It's just really bizarre, really fun. And you have like a whole subgenre of more comedic, more quirky. Don't want to recommend Sherman's March to you because it's well over 2 hours and might be a little bit too eccentric, but that's pretty much a rom-com, like a really eccentric, almost Woody Allen style rom-com, like stream of consciousness style. So there are these films out there, and obviously you have these like Adam said, these really weird, quirky, eccentric core premises like Hands on Hard Body, which is just film about people who can win a car if they hold their hand on a car the longest. You have a circle, there's a car, there's a bunch of relatively eccentric people. Like, you kind of have to be to join this contest, so it's also a lot about poverty. And they just stand there, they hold their hand in this body as people drop off, and it's essentially about the resilience. It's something you haven't really seen before. And I don't think it could be done in fiction. I don't think it has been done in fiction. And you can get these kind of really weird insights into the human psyche from documentaries that you definitely miss if you weren't seeing these kinds of films.
Those that you're describing do sound quite interesting, Chris. You know, kind of more quirky, weirder ones that are focusing on unusual aspects of life that you don't always see, but things that are quite interesting to me or sound quite interesting. You definitely hit the nail on the head with Hoop Dreams. A 3-hour film about basketball is just not something that I would be willing to entertain. But looking at the synopsis for Stevie, that could be one that potentially sounds a little more interesting. But we'll have to see if any more of you please do the job and get me to seek out some documentaries. We'll have to see how the episode pans out.
Just one thing before Saul jumps in and criticizes whatever I'm saying. Yeah, Stevie is probably one that would appeal to Tom, but Hoop Dreams, when people say like, oh, it's a 3-hour documentary about basketball, it's totally missing the point of the documentary and of documentaries in general, because you don't have to be interested in basketball. You know, it's like when you watch a feature film about like boxing and that kind of thing. I've got absolutely no interest whatsoever in boxing, wrestling, or anything like that. Yeah, there can be like there's feature films about boxing and wrestling that I love because it's like a character study. It's not about the sport, it's about the people. And it's exactly the same with documentaries. So you don't have to care at all about basketball, have any interest in the sport. That's not what the point of the documentary is. The point is just these two young guys and their struggles. It's a personal story about them. So I think if you look at documentaries like I don't like this sport, I don't like this topic, then you miss out on a lot of the best ones. And I think people do the same thing with feature films where they don't like a sport or they don't like a kind of topic and they avoid the film. But in general, that's not the point. I just wanted to say that because I think that's a common view about like sport kind of documentaries, which, you know, sometimes sport documentaries are purely about the sport and you have to really care. But other times it goes much deeper than that. So I wouldn't rule it out on that basis. But I agree that Stevie is something, to be honest, I think that Stevie is something that you would like a lot.
I just fully agree with you there, Adam. And recalling the best films of 2023 podcast, Tom's favorite film of the year was Sean Durkin's The Iron Claw, which is a biographical story about wrestling brothers. Obviously, like, it follows the true history of it. It removed one brother from real life, but like otherwise, it's very true, very close to what actually happened. It just followed the progression of that family. That managed to pretty much cut you to your core, Tom. And I think that a documentary can essentially do very much the same thing. Like, it doesn't matter if you're not into wrestling or into basketball. If, you know, it puts the human at the center of it and shows their trials and tribulations, personal tragedy, and so on, that can transcend any interest you might have. Like, it's like, I'm not interested in wrestling at all. I thought Iron Claw was great. I'm not interested in basketball at all, especially not college basketball. I thought Hoop Dreams was great. So I would definitely warn against avoiding films just because like that specific sport or that specific topic doesn't interest you, because very often like the best documentaries and like we talk about the best feature films, they can do something else entirely and just bring you into like the human side of things, regardless of your predisposed interests.
Yeah, I think that's a very good argument, and Adam makes a great case there. It's interesting to note that when it comes to feature films, I will watch almost absolutely everything, regardless of my interests. But with documentaries, the only chance I'd really ever watch a documentary is if it's about a subject that I am interested in. It's strange that I've closed myself off in that way, but perhaps it is just because the amount of documentaries I've watched where they've done nothing for me and left me cold. I find it harder to connect with documentaries than feature films. It just means that I've imposed some limitations, because when I sit down and watch a film, you know, I want to be entertained, I want to enjoy it. I don't want to come away thinking I've wasted, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever. And that has often happened when I've watched documentaries. So it's natural that I've kind of imposed some restrictions to make sure that I'm not wasting my time in that regard, I suppose.
I'd probably say that in terms of convincing Tom to watch documentaries, yes, Hoop Dreams is one of those all-time classics, but it's probably not the best place to start because, like Tom said, he sort of wants things that he might be interested in. So, I mean, for example, one that I might recommend to him would be Room 237 because he's really into The Shining. That's a documentary about all the conspiracy theories about The Shining and about how Kubrick may or may not have faked the moon landing and left clues for in The Shining. So that would be a great place to start. Somewhere else which would be great for him to maybe start would be Beware the Slender Man, about the Slender Man myth, because that's sort of horror adjacent. But I guess just anything that's a little bit weird and out there. I mean, I was writing messages in the chat that was interrupting Chris and Adam when they were talking and saying that this is not weird enough. In terms of weird films, one that Tom might like, which is a documentary, is called Three Identical Strangers. It's about three men who suddenly realize as adults they all look similar and they're actually identical triplets that were separated at birth, but it's very twisty and turny and the plot doesn't just stop there. There's some other great weird ones, like this one called Class Action Park about this theme park that was run in the 1980s that had like tons of accidents and injuries and yet managed to keep still going. Penny Lane, who's one of the great female documentary makers out there. She's got some really great, strange but true documentaries out there. There's one called Nuts, which she did about 6 or 7 years ago, about this person way back when who actually managed to convince people to let him insert goat testicles inside their testicles in order to make them more potent as like a cure for impotency, actually having goat testicles inserted in them. And that sort of plays out as a semi-animated documentary, which is incredibly interesting to look at. But Penny Lane also did Hail Satan, about the Satanic Temple, which again Tom might be interested in as something horror adjacent. And that's really interesting documentary because it starts off as being sort of making fun of the Satanic Temple, but as the documentary progresses, we actually see that some of the views that they have are actually really important and relevant political points to make. Some other documentaries that I might just recommend to Tom while I'm here. Take Care of Maya was released on Netflix last year. That I'd say would probably rival Dear Zachary as the most stressful documentary that I've seen. It's about a 10-year-old girl who's taken into hospital, and then while she's there, the hospital staff refuse to let her go and refuse to let the parents in because they wrongfully suspect the parents of abusing her. And it's about this whole fight and legal battle for the parents to actually get to see their daughter again and all the sort of things that the hospital staff do and all their ticking boxes that actually totally tear the family apart. So that's incredibly stressful. Just for some more thriller-like ones, I'll probably recommend Tickled and Mr. Organ, both by the same director, about basically a reporter investigating these things, and they ended up being stranger and more unusual than they seemed to be at first. Again, incredibly twisted. Tickled for me is one of those all-time great documentaries because there's so many twists and turns. And even when you go back and rewatch it, just seeing like the deep rabbit hole that he dives into is just incredibly interesting. We've got films also like Abducted in Plain Sight, which is about this girl was abducted not once but twice by her neighbor and the way the parents sort of let that slide. So for me, there's a lot of great documentaries out there that I think would sort of be aligned to Tom's interest if he felt like going that way. And then maybe if he sort of gets more into it based on those things, then he might be more inclined to check out something like Hoop Dreams, which is on a subject that maybe doesn't appeal to him the most.
You have got this all planned out for me, haven't you, Sol? There's a lot of recommendations to take in there. If I were to watch just one of them on a punt to see if that's going to convince me that documentaries are worth watching, which one would you pick? And also, before I let you answer, I have actually seen Room 237 and I did really enjoy it because that's another area of documentaries I enjoy, any that are about the filmmaking process. obviously if they are looking at a film that I am interested in.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot to say just one. I could probably narrow it down to three or two or three. I mean, look, Take Care of Maya would definitely be one that comes to mind because it is super stressful, like Dear Zachary was. But I'm also tempted to go with The Imposter just because that one plays out so much like a horror thriller. You like, barely forget what you're watching, and that what you're actually seeing is a documentary and not a narrative. Just the way everything's structured becomes more twisted. So I guess I can't really tear myself between them, but I'd probably say those it would be one of those two would be the one where I'd say might actually push you over the edge in a good way.
Sounds good. If I do take the punt, I might do a coin flip on those. We'll see.
Yeah, that was a lot of recommendations. So I mean, you might be spot on with things like Take Care of My and many of the others there. I mean, I have to say that the Netflix ones you mentioned there, like Take Care of My, those did not hit me that hard. That's not really the type of documentary that I'm drawn to because they're more here's what happened. I didn't find them to be cinematically creative enough because that's usually the main thing that draws me into cinema. Like, what are you doing with the style of cinema itself, the narrative, like the type of angles you're shooting in, essentially the author style. You know, like I look at documentaries pretty much the same way I look at a feature film. I judge them pretty much on the same metrics, which is why, you know, I'm not gonna recommend Tom my favorite documentaries. Like, I'm not gonna sit there like, you know, News from Home, that's something you should definitely see. Or, you know, Jonas Mekas, I mean, I know he didn't like as I was moving, but here are some others like Lost. You can, but no, I'm not gonna do that at all. I mean, I think that my picks for favorite documentaries would be very essayistic, usually very on the art house side, not for you, Tom. I think Soul is probably much closer. In fact, I will probably echo some of Saul's recommendations. I think that one of the things you don't get in fiction at all are things like Mr. Organ and the type of David Ferrier and even like Michael Moore, really, and like all of these other directors who insert themselves into the story they're telling, and they kind of just talk about like an investigation they were in, but tell it chronologically, and they have twists and turns, and they find interesting characters. Mr. Organ plays like a thriller in many ways, but it also plays a bit like a dark comedy. A lot of people have called it exploitative in the same way that a lot of people have called Dear Zachary exploitative. They take people who are probably a little bit mentally disturbed and they make and some things that happen that could be like it's kind of maybe they shouldn't have been showing it, but they hit a nerve. It's entertaining as hell and it just take you through this wild ride, and that's a type of thing you don't really get in fiction. Definitely I would recommend Mr. Organ, but and also David Ferrier's Tickled. I hope he makes a lot more films like this. But there are other types of documentaries as well. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that these are things you should be running out and seeing first, Tom, I do think that, you know, the fact that you have films like the Maisels brothers, especially Grey Gardens, like that's a comedic drama about eccentric mother and daughter just living together and following their day-to-day lives, their interactions. Like, you do have these films that they're real, but they're shot in such a way that essentially they work as narrative dramas. Like Honeyland was nominated for Best Documentary at the Oscars a couple of years ago. That's another more narrative, fly-on-the-wall style documentary about this dying beekeeper culture, essentially, an older woman and her even older mother just trying to survive, issues with the neighbors, and it just starts spiraling more and more out of control. And these kinds of films where, you know, the directors just go somewhere, they spend years with people, they film them, and then you get like a really human narrative out of it. Those kinds of films can hit very hard. They have the narrative there to bring you through it. They don't have those sit people down in a chair, have them talk, like which I often say is the laziest thing in the world. They usually hate talking heads. Like, there's so many documentaries that don't have them at all. They just tell great human stories. And if I were to recommend you one that's close to my heart, not more thriller oriented and going slightly more out on a limb, I would actually recommend an Oscar-winning documentary from 1972 called Marjo, which is about a child preacher who loses his faith, and he essentially sets out to con people into thinking he is this religious guru, is essentially this ultimate preacher, and just spreads the gospel and earns money. It's darkly hilarious. It's very cutting. The central character, which obviously a real person, it's pretty close to one of a kind, and it just hits a lot of nerves. So I think like that type of documentary. Saul recommended these thrillers, and I agree you should definitely check them out. Those are probably closer to your heart. But I think in terms of what documentaries can do and be in terms of narratives and character studies and also societal studies, and just at the same time being funny and cutting, Marjo is just a really, really great choice.
I've just been looking at the synopsis for Marjo, and I don't know, I mean, your description kind of made it sound semi-appealing, Chris, but looking at it, it's probably not something that really appeals to me as a film to watch to try and convince me to get into documentaries. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I like it, but I don't know, it's not one that really has an appeal for me.
That's perfectly all right, Tom. I'm just trying to push it slightly away from the thrillers, but no, yeah. Saul's recommendations are probably better, so in that case, I'll just say check out Mr. Organ. I think that's going to be right up your alley.
Okay, I'll put Mr. Organ on the tentative pile.
But to spin the conversation around a little bit to the art of things, like in your mind, Tom, can documentaries be art or great works at the same level as fiction films, or do you think of them as something like lesser or below or separate from fiction altogether?
I think that they can be considered great works of art. However, it's not a type of art that speaks to me, which is why I tend to avoid them. And when I'm creating lists of films for polls and such, documentaries, they're the same as shorts. They just would never be included. I just focus solely on feature films because that's where my area of interest lies. I'm not dismissing them and saying that there's no value to them. It's just something that doesn't speak to me.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that you excluded them completely. So just remind me, like, what were your favorite documentaries of all time again?
So I think my favourites would be Dear Zachary, Anvil, Grizzly Man, King of Kong. They're the ones that come to mind that I did really enjoy.
So if there was like a best films of the 2000s, I think all of them are from the 2000s, if I remember correctly. Like none of those would be on your list.
No, that's right. And even though I think Dear Zachary, when I first watched it, it might have even been rated like a 9 or 10 on IMDb from my perspective, but it would not be on my list of films for the relevant year because I just don't consider documentaries to be the same as feature films.
I will now into bigotry. I mean, I see Saul is writing here that he excludes short films from his top 1,000. I actually do the same. So, I mean, I am a short film bigot, and we had a full episode where people were attacking me, and I think Saul, and we had an episode where we were trying to confront ourselves as bigots in terms of short films. But yeah, I'm surprised that. I mean, maybe you brought it up then already, and that's how we spiraled into this episode. But yeah, I just can't imagine excluding documentaries. Even if you go to They Should Pictures, don't they, for instance, like some of the most acclaimed films, like A Man with the Movie Camera, Shua, Sans Soleil, again, The Cleaner's Night, those kind of films, those are all towards the top of the list. Documentaries have always, to me, been interchangeable with fiction films in terms of just the potential to be great films. I don't love as many documentaries, but then again, there's not as many documentaries that are highly rated, and for a very, very long time, they didn't make as many documentaries as fiction films. But wow, yeah, I'm a bit something what to say there. I mean, do you include documentaries in your list? I mean, how do you feel about Tom just excluding them altogether?
I would include documentaries on favorites lists. I think sometimes, despite the fact that I would do that, sometimes I find it quite difficult to rank features and documentaries alongside each other. But I think they do deserve a place. Actually, I can kind of understand why Tom wouldn't include them, and it sounds like Tom doesn't include them because he sees them separately, not because he doesn't rate documentaries. And I think actually the episode is kind of showing that Tom just maybe hasn't seen as many documentaries as some of the people here, like Sol and Chris. And if he did see more, he probably would have more favorites. So yeah, I would include them on my favorites list, but I can understand why people would distinguish between them, just like people do with shorts as well. So I don't think that makes Tom a bigot, unlike Chris with short films.
Out of curiosity, I've just checked my letterbox and I have 73 documentary films rated. And looking through them just kind of helps to remind me why I'm not interested in them. There's quite a few documentaries that I watched for the World Cup game that we play on the ICM forum. When people nominate a documentary for this, I feel like I have to watch it because I'm taking part in their cup. But none of the documentaries people have ever nominated have done anything for me. So I always get a sense of frustration when someone nominates one and knowing that I'm going to have to sit through it and enjoy it. So a lot of the ones that I have seen have just kind of been chores, and it's just another reason why I'm so averse to watching documentaries.
I think you're watching the wrong documentaries. I mean, for a start, 73 films is a tiny number for ICM people. And I think it's harder to watch films from a list or recommendations from the World Cup when it comes to documentaries. Like, for example, I've been watching the sort of top 300 2020 films on ICM, and that's really not the best way to find documentaries, because there's all these music documentaries, there's all these sort of specific kind of documentaries that appeal to certain people. I think with documentaries, it's a lot harder to find documentaries that you'll like, because some of the lists or the recommendations are really geared towards a specific type of person. So I think, yeah, the fact that you've only seen 73 is probably that's the reason why you don't have more favorites. And I think if you worked through sort of more documentaries that appeal to you, rather than sort of going for like World Cup recommendations or ones on lists or that kind of thing, I think you would find far more that work, because there's a lot more documentaries that I think are a chore because they're kind of about something that you just don't care about. But as I said, like with Hoop Dreams, you don't care about basketball, but that's different because it's well made. Whereas a lot of documentaries aren't that well made, but people just like the topic, in my experience.
For a little bit of context, the World Cup we refer to here is a forum game we play on icmforum.com, where each player is a manager for a specific country, and they're meant to highlight not the biggest films from that country. Unless it's a very relatively small country, there's a cap on votes on IMDb, and very often people are trying to get attention for very obscure favorites as well. You will often get films that are only going to appeal to a small niche of people, regardless of genre. It's really not the best place to get recommendations of films that's going to match up well for you, because very often, regardless of genre, these are, first of all, niche, obscure favorites from an individual user. Not the best way to go about it. There's also been a bit of a quiet lull here because everyone is discussing whether or not 73 is a large or small or decent number, with Adam being quite vehement that this is a ridiculously small number, he has to watch more, and Saul being a bit more understanding, shockingly. Given that Tom hates documentaries, 73 is pretty damn good, I'd say. According to IMDb, I've seen 725, so you have a while to catch up to us, but I don't think you want to, so... Like, if you compare horror films, I'm pretty sure, like, Tom would be towering over me by a really, really, really huge margin.
Yeah, you're probably right there with horror films, and that's just reminded me of something else. The fact that I really, really like the horror subgenre of mockumentaries, and that is because anything can happen in them. Anything can happen, so it's not the limitations of a documentary. And I love it. Films like Blair Witch Project, Wreck, like Mungo, Afflicted. I really like the mockumentary subgenre, not just horror actually, but other films like Spinal Tap. But yeah, put a real documentary on, and yeah, I'm not interested.
That's quite interesting, Tom, because I would say that in general, I actually don't really like mockumentaries. I'm not sure why exactly. I mean, there are a couple of reasons why. When you talk about things like Blair Witch, it's the found footage aesthetic, which I'm not really into. So it's possibly with some of that. But even things like Waiting for Guffman or This Is Spinal Tap, those films have never really appealed to me. I guess maybe I see them as trying a bit too hard to be funny. But when I hear that something's a mockumentary, it actually decreases my interest in viewing it, interestingly enough.
There you go. So now you know how I feel, Sol, when I hear that something's a documentary. Decreases my interest.
Yeah, fair enough. Though I do still find it strange that you actively exclude films you love from your lists. Like that's something. And like, I mean, I get it that you see them as separate, but I just don't understand why you see them as that separate.
I suppose it just comes back to the fact that I have no interest in viewing them. So when documentaries make a poll of the greatest films of that year, it kind of frustrates me because that's taken up a space for a good feature film that could have been on the list that I might actually be interested in seeing.
Yeah, but you love it. Not the people who are voting for documentaries anyways. Like, you love their Zachary. Like, why wouldn't you want to vote for their Zachary since you love it?
Probably because IMDb excluded documentaries from their top 250, and that's just always been my basis of how I rate things.
Damn it, IMDb.
So we've got IMDb to blame for this. They've ruined everything for me.
IMDb is out there indoctrinating children against documentaries.
Exactly, yeah. And it's like with kind of rating systems as well. My rating system is based around, the ratings on IMDb. And once you've gone so far with something, it can be hard to change your ways. There's no way I'm changing my rating system now. So there's probably no way I'm changing my view on documentaries just because I'm being stubborn. But maybe some of the recommendations you guys have got, maybe I'll stick one on and things could change. We'll see.
This isn't that interesting, but recently IMDb have actually taken away documentary as like a title type, and now it's a genre instead. So maybe they're moving towards a more inclusive approach. You have to search by genre now to find documentaries instead of. I think it used to be split up into like feature, documentary, short. Now it's just movie is the standard one. All features are movies on IMDb, including documentaries. So it's a little bit more inclusive of documentaries than it used to be. But I don't think they're going to change the top 250 if anyone still works on that.
Yeah, thankfully I don't still work on the top 250 because if they shifted it up and a load of documentaries entered, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I probably would have made myself sit through those documentaries. But now I've long abandoned the list thanks to things like Hamilton that will just turn up. Not going to watch that one.
Yeah, Sol just made a good point that documentaries get a higher rating on IMDb than features in general. But I think that's because a lot of documentaries cover topics that appeal to certain people, and those people watch it, and they don't get as wide an audience as some of the features do. So I think it would be quite difficult on IMDb to include. I think it'd be quite difficult on IMDb to include documentaries and features together. That being said, if you did have documentaries on the top 250, the rating would probably go down because a wider spectrum of people would watch them.
Yeah, good point. And I'm also not sure, like, do documentaries really get that much higher ratings? I mean, I see Mr. Organ, for instance, which granted is more of a genre thing, it's like a 6.6. So, like, that's would be a pretty normal rating. Like, I mean, I don't follow, like, a lot of the more super mainstream documentaries, so, like, I haven't seen My Octopus Teacher yet, for instance. So, I mean, there's obviously some new ones that have really high ratings, but then lots of Marvel films have 8 point something too, so it's not like it's that shocking.
One type of documentary I don't generally like is like a music documentary, because sometimes they're great, but there's often ones that focus on like a band, for example. They'll often have like very high ratings, like 8+ on IMDb, because generally it's fans of the band that are watching it rather than a sort of bigger audience. So yeah, I do think there are some documentaries like that that have a lower number of votes and a higher rating just because they're only appealing to like a specific fan base rather than film goers in general.
I think Adam is right about concert documentaries. Stop Making Sense actually, I believe, has a higher rating than Come and See and The Godfather on Letterboxd. So it actually is technically the highest rated feature. But the issue is that it's mainly just seen by people who are fans of Talking Heads or people who want to complete one of the lists on Letterboxd or maybe I Check Movies. So the audience for it's not quite as general as it would be otherwise. If it was maybe inducted into the IMDb top 250, or if Letterboxd actually had a combined list for documentaries and features rather than separate lists as they do, maybe more people would watch it and its rating would go down. But I remember that after I watched it last year when A24 came out with a restoration, I was like, this is pretty good, but it's not really that special. It's not really that innovative as a documentary. I'm really surprised it's the highest rated documentary on Letterboxd. And somebody actually chimed in on the forum and actually said, well, yeah, it's because people are watching it, are fans of the music, people who don't avoid it. Like with the Taylor Swift documentary, the Eras Tour, that's got very high ratings also. That's because people who aren't Swifties aren't watching it. So I'd agree with concert stuff. It does make sense. And a bit of an interesting argument there. Do we keep it out because they're going to get flooded with all these things only a small number have seen, or do we let them in order that more people can watch them? But then do you really want people watching films they're not going to like? So that's another argument also.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of these concert type documentaries. Basically, they leave me cold as well, especially if it's bands that I'm not interested in, but often even if it's bands that I'm interested in. And the reason is that I love going to live concerts and nothing can recreate that. So watching it at home or in the cinema, if you're lucky enough to like a band that have a release in cinema, it just doesn't capture that magic and that same feeling. So it's not a type of media that I'm ever really interested in.
I don't even just mean concert films. I guess documentaries. I also mean like I just watched one about the Bee Gees, and it's not a concert film. It's like their story, and that's got like 8.1, and it wouldn't have 8.1 if far more people were watching it. Not that it's like a bad documentary, just because I just mean there's a lot of documentaries out there that are sort of the history of a band, and they tend to be less interesting because unless you really like the band, they tend to just be a bit more of a standard story. So those are the types of documentaries that don't really appeal to me as much. I don't think they do much in terms of filmmaking. It's much more like just an interesting story about a band, kind of, rather than a film.
Yeah, I'm actually going to agree with most of what you guys have said so far. I mean, I think that concert films, even if I love the bands, it's something I generally avoid. Like Adam said, it's not going to be particularly cinematically interesting. It's just going to be like about the music. I mean, it can be fun watching it just for that, especially if you couldn't see them live. But like, it's not going to be great cinema. They're not going to be great films. I mean, I might upset some people here, but let's take The Last Waltz. So that's directed by Martin Scorsese, which is one of my favorite directors of all time. It's about the final concept of the band, which is one of my favorite bands of all time. It has guest appearances by Bob Dylan, who's my favorite singer of all time. I mean, they have Neil Young. They have so many other huge musicians that participates in it that I adore. It's not a great film. I mean, I'm sorry. It's a well made. It's a well shot concert. The music is great, but in terms of the cinema, I don't see how this will be celebrated as like something that's absolutely incredible in cinema. And similarly with Stop Making Sense, that's not a good concert film. It's shot a bit more creatively, I would say, than The Last Waltz. So it's trying to be something a little bit more, but that's still just a concert film. It's still just Like there's nothing. There's just nothing that wins me over to the point that, oh my god, this is one of the greatest films of all time, or this is a great film. Like that's not there. The music is good, it's well made, but that's about it. And I think you might be right that these films do have a high rating just because people are fans of the music and they're rating it because of the music, and that can definitely be something I agree with you is a bit of an issue.
I probably agree with everybody else that concert documentaries are a bit down there for me in terms of documentaries. But I do have to say that Woodstock is an incredibly dynamic film. For me, that one's not just about the music, it's actually about the way it is edited together with a split screen, with reaction shots, with shots of the crowd, everybody going about their business and all the free love stuff. For me, the music's only really maybe 50% of Woodstock. For me, the other 50% of it is in the editing there. It's in what we see or the people attending the event do. That for me is what makes the film. And yeah, that for me, I guess, was missing from Stop Making Sense, which was just about the performances and the choreography, which is great, but it's not as dynamic as something like Woodstock is. But again, Woodstock 3-hour documentary, I would not recommend that as somewhere for Tom to start first with documentaries.
I've actually liked or loved one music-oriented documentary, which is 1+1 or Sympathy for the Devil, the one Godard made with the Rolling Stones, but that's obviously not a documentary. Like that's half fiction, half documentary, and it plays around with it a lot. So that doesn't count at all. So yeah, no, I've never loved a concert film or anything close to it. It seems though. Again, Stop Making Sense, Last Waltz, etc. are good.
I was just looking up at the synopsis for that Godard film, Chris, and it sounds like my worst nightmare. The Rolling Stones rehearse Sympathy for the Devil in the studio, whilst Godard reflects on 1968 society, politics, and culture. It just sounds boring and dull. Yeah, this isn't the escapism I want at the end of it. A long day at work.
It also have Black Panthers murdering lots of people, and you have a woman called Miss Democracy being interviewed by a TV crew walking around with lots of gun shooting, lots of tracking shots. It's like Weekend on steroids.
You're making me sound like I'm just someone who wants endless violence now.
No, I'm saying it still probably wouldn't work for you because I don't think you liked Weekend either.
Yeah, it wasn't much for Weekend.
But yeah, for people who liked Weekend, you probably still like 1+1. Seems like we might have talked through this as much as we can. I mean, we've been trying to convince Tom to, drop this two-tier system where he doesn't really consider documentaries to be films. And let's see if he can change his mind. He says he probably won't. My last question was, what will it take for you to change your mind? But again, you already answered that. You won't. Maybe the solution is just seeing more documentaries that are more like cinema that you enjoy. We'll see. Adam is screaming out Stevie. I was gonna ask you like how you feel about like the most acclaimed documentaries of all time, the acclaimed documentaries like Zika Vertov, like Man with the Movie Camera. I assume you don't care for them at all?
No, I've seen Man with a Movie Camera and that didn't really do anything for me. Is it Chris Marker film, that Sans Soleil? I watched that because of it was in the most favourite list and that just found it boring. And also, is it Samsara? That was boring. I don't know, I just need a great story, some cinematic qualities, and escapism, and that is rarely seen in documentaries. I'm sure you guys are going to say, yeah, it is, and here's some examples. But from what I've seen, it's just, yeah.
That's where the issue is. So yeah, you have been seeing a lot of these critically acclaimed films that are much closer to like my heart and my sensibilities. We just have all of these essay films and like art house films and personal explorations and things like that. You have Jonas Mekas, you have Agnes Varda, who's a bit more mainstream, to be honest. Like Agnes Varda can really connect with young people and be fun, and maybe she'll be your entryway. But I think just listening to Saul might be your safest bet. Watch the films he's recommending you, and then As you know, we see more documentaries with great narratives and with great drive, and well, which just work as entertainment. Maybe slowly in 10 years your mind will be changed. Who knows?
It could happen. You never know. And maybe one day we'll be creating a documentary about my experiences watching documentaries. That could be one I'm interested in watching.
Yeah, I guess my final thing is to tell Tom to watch TV because I think he'll like it and it will appeal to his general film interests. I don't think Tom has said anything particularly unreasonable or controversial, despite Chris's opening to this episode.
Yeah, I'm disappointed. I was hoping for a bloodbath.
But at the same time, like I think it's also clear that Tom hasn't really watched that many documentaries. There's still room for him to find ones that he does like and change his opinion because I think he hasn't seen enough to kind of confirm. Maybe he's confirmed certain ones he doesn't like, but I don't think he's seen enough to confirm that he hates documentaries, really.
I mean, I think I have because I've no interest in watching them anymore. But yeah, maybe from your guys' perspective, I should have watched more before making my mind up. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I mean I think that's the only source of argument is whether or not you've seen enough. I would say, considering how many feature films you've seen, yeah, I don't know why Saul thinks that 73 is a lot because like Tom's probably seen like tens of thousands of films, you know, so the percentage of the percentage of documentaries he's seen will be tiny, whereas he's seen endless feature films. If you'd only seen 73 feature films, you might not love them because you might have not seen the right ones. I don't think samurai films is a comparison either because, yeah, anyway, I just don't think 73 is enough. And when you're talking about someone who's watched thousands of films, it's nowhere near enough to give a representation of the genre, in my opinion.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think if Tom had actively been hunting out the documentaries that he was most inclined to love, I think I would have seen it a bit different because then 73 would probably have been quite representative. But if it is 73 based on, okay, he's going through the best of all time lists, which have a very, very clear art house stint. You have like more experimental films on top usually, like a lot of films that are like Salt said that Memories Mirror Camera is barely a documentary because it's more about style, and it's true. Like these are films without narratives, or you have very experimental films, or you have, like Tom said, he'll explore the World Cup documentaries, and he's been participating in pretty much every World Cup documentary. So I have to assume like 10, 20 of those 73 documentaries he's seen are from the World Cup, and those are again going to be niche favorites for specific forum members. I think that if he follows Saul's advice and watches more thriller-like, suspenseful, escapist documentaries that are not art house oriented, I think he might change his mind down the road, or at least find a lot more documentaries he really likes.
Well, I don't know. I do think 73 is a lot for somebody who doesn't like or is not particularly fond of a genre. I mean, you think about like the average list on iCheck Movies, or maybe not the average, but the most common number would be 50 films. So he's definitely gone beyond that. The average country list on iCheck Movies would probably also be about 50 films. So I think 73 is a fairly deep dive of something you don't like. And I put samurai films down. I wrote it down as a chat as an example because that's not a genre that I'm particularly fond of. And there's no way that I've seen 73 samurai films, but I've definitely seen enough, probably in the 20s or 30s of samurai films that I know that I'm not particularly fond of them. Basically, I can understand why Tom's against documentaries, and I think he's seen a decent enough sample size to have that opinion. That said, though, I would say that in general, anybody who doesn't like documentaries is watching the wrong sort of documentaries because there's tons and tons and tons of very different documentaries out there. And I think if Tom starts watching the right documentaries that are more orientated towards his taste, he'll probably overcome his prejudices also. So that's just my final thought there. Anybody who doesn't like documentaries, it's because you're watching the wrong sorts of documentaries.
I think that's perfect way to sum it up. If you're not enjoying documentaries, you're just watching the wrong documentaries. Take that to heart, all documentary haters and documentary lovers, or people who are actually in more or less the same boat as Tom there, who specifically wants film to be escapist entertainment and don't just like want to learn or watch a documentary on a topic that doesn't interest them. Come to icmforum.com and just start recommending great suspenseful documentaries so that Tom might find some new favorites in there. I mean, I can tell from my own experience with musicals, which is my least favorite genre by far and one I often avoid. I've seen more musicals than Tom has seen documentaries, and I've found some absolute favorites from there, like All That Jazz, for instance. So there are often things that don't feel like the thing that you don't like. I mean, Tom is very good at expressing what he doesn't like about documentaries. Not all documentaries are like that. Listen to Saul, watch his recommendations, and maybe in a decade we'll be watching the documentary of how Tom changed his mind. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.